This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. It feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? there was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually about tax avoidance. Yeah. I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here. 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum asked the question, what must industry do to prevent a broad social backlash? The answer is very simple. Just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. Taxes. We need to... just 2 days ago, there was a billionaire in here, what's his name? Michael Dell. And he asked the question like, name me one country where a top marginal tax rate of 70% has actually worked. And, I'm a historian. The United States, that's where it has actually worked. In the 1950s, during Republican President Eisenhower, the war veteran, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91% for people like Michael Dell. The top estate tax for people like Michael Dell was more than 70%. This is not rocket science. We can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Thank you. And then go to what you are doing, which is financial inclusion. That is, how do we link the cash transfers, the income, the basic income, with the bancarization, I don't know how you say that, but how do we put these people into the banking system and so they know how to handle their own money and so forth. But I think these are some concrete measures that should be taken. Many of them come from the governments, of course. We need the support of the private sector. The private sector needs to have, again, this moral, how do you say, fiscal, moral contribution. And I think this is something that we were talking about. I don't want them to pay 90% of taxes. I only want them to pay the taxes.
Michael Dell should.
Just pay the taxes. In Latin America, it's 18% of GDP. Just pay that.
Rutger, and then we should open it up. What you're a historian. What would it take, and does history suggest it's possible, to make it so that, 5 years from now, when you fly back here on your private jet...
no, on a bus.
On a bus, rock across the Alps, something will, we will have made some headway.
Yeah, well, the lessons of history are pretty depressing, to be honest. So the times that we've seen that we managed to reduce inequality radically, were during times of war. That's what's the most effective way. Now, I'm obviously not suggesting we should start a war here, but what we do need is what the philosopher William James 100 years called the moral equivalent of war. And I believe that the challenge of climate change can be exactly that. So we need to realize that we are standing, at a point in history as a species that we just don't have much time left. And what we need is a new Green Deal, I believe. Look at the experience of France. So what happened in France is that you had this whole yellow vest movement after, a tax on petrol, if I'm correct. And then an explosion of protests broke out. A French CEO explained to me this week that actually the most important reason for all of these protests was the abolition of the wealth tax in France. So, it's not rocket science. What we need are way higher taxes on the wealthy so that we can actually fund this green transition to a much better planet. But, the scale of the challenge is so radical is that, again, it will never be solved by just the private sector alone or just by words alone or by philanthropy. We really need to start to realize that we need something like the moral equivalent of a war.
I want to ask Rutger one quick question, and then I go to you. Just turning it to politics, because the data are complex about whether and where growth is raising wages for the poorest in the world. By some measures, wages are going up, but so is cost of living. I mean, what isn't in doubt is that the reality and perception of inequality is driving incredible political upheaval. I mean, it's remarkable to me this year at Davos how many of the world leaders, we're talking about shaping global architecture, the principal architects are locked in their basements. So many of the world leaders are back at home dealing with the upheaval caused by the topic we're talking about today. And Rutger, I just wanted your historical perspective on how that plays out. We can debate the data, but the reality is that we have a political world that is under siege.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me give you both a historical and a personal perspective. I was born in 1988, so that was 1 year before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I grew up in the 90s when people believed that, we had arrived at the end of history and that all that was left to solve was, climate change and maybe a bit poverty. We talk a little bit about inequality, but that's it. We were all liberal Democrats and the rest of the world was supposed to follow. Then we had the financial crash in 2008. Now we've seen the rise of populists around the globe, right? Trump, Bolsonaro, we've seen Brexit. And what gives me great hope right now is that there's a new generation that is actually waking up. That it doesn't believe the myth anymore, that the vast inequality we see today is just the force of nature, an inevitable consequence of globalization or technology. There's a new generation that just doesn't believe it anymore, that sees that most of the wealth that's being possessed by many of the participants here has not been earned through hard work, but been extracted from workers who are doing the real work, but not being paid a living wage. So that is what really gives me hope. And that's, I think, what all these movements are about. It's about people waking up and realizing that they've been sold a lie. That's what's happening.